Parashas Mishpotim is replete with the laws that govern an halachic civil society. One of them is the requirement to loan people money. And what happens when a person stands up as a guarantor on the loan? The Rebbe is going to share a pilpul about the difference between the Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi in context of a person who stands as a guarantor of a loan after the loan has already gone into effect. And from that, he'll teach us a powerful lesson about the inter-responsibility that every Jew has for every other Jew. Isa b'Mishnah Seif Baba Basra. This is a Mishnah at the end of Baba Basra. The Rebbe is using this as a siyum on Masechta Baba Basra. Arev hayotze la'achar chitum shtoris. If a person emerges as a guarantor on a loan after the loan documents had already been signed, govim menechasim b'nei chorin. If the creditor wants to claim the money on that loan from the guarantor, he can only take it from assets that the guarantor does not have tied down in any other kind of business or personal responsibility. Says the Mishnah, there was such a story that came in front of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel said that the creditor may claim against the guarantor, but only from assets that are free and not already tied up in any other kind of business deal. So Ben Nanas says to Rabbi Shmuel, I disagree. And the creditor cannot take anything from this guarantor because the guarantor only put his name on the line after the loan had already gone through, and so you cannot claim any of his assets. So Rabbi Shmuel says to Ben Anas, why not? Ben Anas says to him, let's imagine a scenario. Let's say that there's a person who's literally choking his debtor in the street. And another individual came past and saw what was going on. He said, let him go, implying, I'll pay you whatever he owes you. Potter, that person does not owe a cent, because the loan was never based on trusting this individual to cover whatever the debtor can't pay. Says Ben Nanas, what kind of a guarantor is in fact required to pay when the debtor cannot pay? That's halveu. If the person says, you lend him the money and I'll pay if he cannot, then chayav, then the person is required, the guarantor is required to step in and cough up if the individual can't pay. Shekena al emunasoi, hilvo, key phrase, because it was on the trusting of that guarantor that the creditor extended credit, lent money to the debtor. The Tana then concludes, Rabbi Shmuel said, if a person wants to be wise, they should engage in learning the halachas of financial interactions, because there's no other part of Torah that is more involved than that. And they are like literally a flowing spring. And if a person really wants to learn the halachas of finances properly, then you should be a student serving Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas, implying that Rabbi Shmuel believes that Ben Nanas is this incredible scholar in this particular area of halacha. But the Gemara commenting on this machlokes says, despite the fact that Rabbi Shmuel made this beautiful accolade for Ben Nanas and how he is this incredible expert in these areas of law, financial matters, nevertheless, halacha kamoisek Rabbi Shmuel, the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel, which means that if a person emerges as a guarantor on a loan after the loan had already been commissioned, then you can claim from that guarantor, but only from assets that are not tied up in other business concepts. Then the Gemara continues. Okay, so if somebody emerges as a guarantor after the loan is signed, you can still claim against him. But Ben Nanas also referred to a different scenario where you literally see somebody choking an individual in the street. So ask the Gemara, what about the case where the guy is being attacked in the street because he hasn't paid his money? So Rabbi Shmuel says, and the commentaries, this is the Rashbam, because there's no Rashi at this point in the Gemara. The Rashbam says, what is the dilemma here? Do we say that the passerby who steps in to intervene, it's because he sees the other guy suffering, literally he's being beaten up in the street, and therefore he is willing to say, you know what, I'm in, gomer o makne, I'm in and I'll pay whatever it takes to help this person out of his problem. Or maybe all he's doing is delaying tactics to avoid this fellow assaulting him in the middle of the street. That's why he said what he said, and he didn't intend to put his finances on the line, and so he didn't really become a guarantor. Which one is it? So does Rabbi Shmuel say that in the case where a guy is literally being attacked by his creditor in the middle of the street and somebody comes to save him, is he also considered a guarantor and has to pay or not? Closer to Ben Nanas. So Doshma says the Gemara, let's prove it. So the Gemara concludes that Rabbi Shmuel disagrees with Ben Anas, even in the case where the guy is being assaulted in the street, and therefore Rabbi Shmuel is of the view that if somebody steps in to intervene, he takes on the responsibility of an Arev, and he does have to pay if the debtor cannot pay. Then the Gemara asks, okay, that's Rabbi Shmuel's opinion. Do we paskin like Rabbi Shmuel in the case where he's saving this fellow from being assaulted or not? So the Gemara says, well, we have precedent. Ravin quotes Rabbi Yochanan, who's obviously a very important authority, to say that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel in the case of Chodok. In other words, if you are walking down the street and you're trying to save a guy who's being beaten up by his creditor, and you say, I'll pay the debt, you are now liable. But a little further, the Gemara continues. The Gemara adds a clause that we didn't originally see. Under what circumstances does the person actually step in as a guarantor in the case of the assault on the street? Only if they made a kinyan, some formality that made him actually show his willingness to be this guarantor. Which implies that under ordinary circumstances, if a person typically wants to become a guarantor, you don't have to make a formality of a kinyan. But here, because of the circumstances, the guy has to make a formality of a kinyan. The Gemara concludes that the final halacha is that if a person says before the loan goes into effect, I will guarantee the loan, you do not have to make a kinyan in order for him to be the guarantor. Whereas but if the loan had already been commissioned and then somebody emerges and says, I'll guarantee the loan, then he has to do something formal in order to show his willingness. So the conclusion there is that when the guy steps in to try and help somebody who's being beaten up by his creditor, there has to be a formal kinyan before he carries any financial responsibility. And that is where this section of the Gemara concludes in the Talmud Bavli, which we're now going to compare to the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi at the same end of Baba Basra says, Rabbi Yosef b'shem Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Rabbi Shmuel is Ben Nanas, even though Rabbi Shmuel gave all these accolades and compliments to Ben Nanas, he was really just giving great compliments to the way he explained or interpreted the halacha out of the circumstances. But the halacha is not like Ben Nanas. So far, the Talmud Yerushalmi is saying the same thing as the Talmud Bavli. We do not follow the halacha like Ben Nanas, and if a person is a guarantor for somebody who's being beaten up, he actually does carry financial responsibility. Then the Gemara continues. Says he says that even in the case where the person's being beaten in the street, the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel's opinion, same as the Talmud Bavli, and that means that the Arev who stepped in is actually taking financial responsibility. But the Talmud Yerushalmi does not put in the clause, which the Bavli did, to say that if you step in to break up a fight by saying, you know what, I'll pay the debt, that it's only binding if you made a kinyan. The Yerushalmi doesn't say that. Nor does it mention any of those distinctions that the Talmud Bavli did make between what time did the guy become the Arev and then whether or not he has to make a kinyan. Instead, the Yerushalmi concludes, so Rabbi Yossi says this, and we're going to have to examine what Rabbi Yossi means. If there's a person who's literally attacking somebody in the street, and somebody else comes along and he says, you let him go and I will pay the money. That next expression is ambiguous. You take the money from the one and you don't take the money from the other. Now at this point, I've said it as a statement, but what we're going to see is there's a possibility that it's intended as a question, as we'll see now. The Pnei Moshe, which is like the Rashi on Yerushalmi, says, Rabbi Yossi was saying this actually out of surprise. In other words, he's saying, let's say that the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel in the case where somebody's being beaten in the street and another person, a third party, comes to try and save him by saying, I'll pay the debt. The halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, which is he takes that financial responsibility. That implies So that means where somebody is literally chasing after another person. This is a paraphrase of the expression by David HaMelech after Shaul. Remember when he cut the Shaul's cloak and he didn't kill him, and he says, "And still you want to come after me to kill me." That's so the Pnei Moshe is paraphrasing that expression. So he's chasing this person, literally looking to beat him in the street. And the other person comes along and says, "No, let him go. I'll pay the debt." So Rabbi Yossi is saying, it sounds like what you're now saying is that the creditor now leaves the debtor alone and goes after this new Arif, this new guarantor. And Rabbi Yossi is surprised by that. Hey, how can you suggest that that's halacha? But how does this person now become the debtor? He only wanted to save the guy from the beating because of a mitzvah ka'avin, and he thinks he's doing a great mitzvah saving him. In other words, the Pnei Moshe's explanation implies that the Gemara Yerushalmi is concluding the same as the Babli, which is that it sounds like the Pnei Moshe is suggesting, based on Rabbi Yossi, saying it cannot be that just because a guy tried to save somebody else's life, now he's carrying the financial burden. Can't be that simple. Surely he needs to make a kinyan, like in the Bavli where we said Rabbi Shmuel also needed to make a belief that you need to make a kinyan. So it would appear in the Pnei Moshe. The Rebbe is not satisfied with that explanation. It's really difficult to imagine that that's really what Rabbi Yossi was saying in the Yerushalmi. Let's say that the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel, even in a case where the person's attacking his debtor in the street. And the person is trying to break up the fight by saying, "I'll pay the money," is now actually putting himself on the line to say he will really pay the money. Whoever suggested that by saying, "I want to be a guarantor," turns him into the debtor, because that's what Rabbi Yossi is so surprised about. Now, is he the debtor instead of the original debtor? To the extent that now you'd imagine that the creditor goes after the guarantor instead of going after the debtor. Because that's how the Pnei Moshe is explaining Rabbi Yossi's opinion, saying Rabbi Yossi is saying, why would you do that? Well, who suggested that? Surely the most logical way to explain it is this third party now steps in as a guarantor, which means that still going forward, the debtor is responsible to repay his loan. And the responsibility the creditor has is to first go after the debtor with everything that he possibly can. With all the details the Mishnah spells out of how it is that you reclaim money that's owed to you. And then only if that fails do you go to the guarantor. Where does the Pnei Moshe get this idea from out of this Gemara that we're suggesting that the guarantor now becomes the new debtor? Zois v'yoid. In addition to which, the Pnei Moshe's explanation is that Tmias Rabbi Yossi Yosedas Alatam, the whole basis for Rabbi Yossi's surprise is because he says, because the guy never intended to put himself on the line and replace the debtor. He just wanted to save him from the beating. Which, by the way, is the exact same thing that Benana said in the Mishnah. Why would the Gemara have to add information that the Mishnah already told us? So what's Rabbi Yossi telling us we don't already know from the Mishnah? Ben Nanas is in the Mishnah. The Talmud Yerushalmi is also quoting the Mishnah. And therefore we already know that there is this way of thinking to say, just because somebody thinks he's doing a mitzvah of saving somebody from a beating, that should not be reason enough to put his finances on the line. Well, then what's Rabbi Yossi saying that Ben Nanas did not already say? Therefore the Rebbe says there's got to be a different explanation of what Rabbi Yossi is saying. And therefore it's more logical to suggest that Rabbi Yossi's commentary follows what the Gemara was saying, which is that even in a case where the person is being assaulted on the street, the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel, which is that a guarantor who now enters the picture would in fact be liable, but only from nechasim b'dei chorin. And Rabbi Yossi is saying, and you know what? That's effective even without a kinyan. In other words, the Yerushalmi is speaking a different maskana to the Bavli. The Bavli said that the halach is like Rabbi Shmuel b'chonuk. If the person who steps up and says, please don't hurt him, I'll pay the money, made a kinyan. No kinyan, no arev. Whereas the conclusion of the Talmud Yerushalmi is different to the Bavli, that if a person says, please don't hurt him, I'll pay the money, according to the Yerushalmi, he is now liable even without a kinyan, and that's what Rabbi Yossi is commenting on. Question is, what's the basis of this debate between the Bavli and Yerushalmi? This debate between the Bavli and Yerushalmi about an Orev who enters the picture after the loan has already happened, whether or not he has to formalize that position with a kinyan or not, that is founded on, or is built on, two different views of what an Orev is and how he becomes an Orev, or how he becomes liable for the loan that actually is not his loan. So we're going to see that there are two possible ways, or two possible explanations of why an Orev is empowered to be part of this loan. So let's go back to the most obvious scenario, which is you're about to put together a loan and you bring in a third party to say, I'll guarantee the loan. So Rav Ashi says, why does this Orev now take on that financial responsibility? Because the fact that this Orev is now seen in the community as a trustworthy individual, because look, the courts are willing, or even individuals, let's leave the courts, that's a different discussion, but an individual is willing to lend money based on his reputation. Whoa, look at me, they trust me. That's a value, it adds hanoah to his life. On that basis, it says, amen, it's worth my while to stand behind this loan because of the reputation it will give me. So it would seem like what Rav Ashi is saying, as many of the person point out, the very fact that he's getting the benefit of being a trustworthy member of the community is reason enough psychologically for him to say, amen, I'll pay the money if this guy falls through. He puts himself on the line. But the Nimuka Yosef takes a different perspective. In the same scenario, which is when you're setting up the loan and the guy says, okay, fine, I'll guarantee the loan. The reason, says the Nimuka Yosef, why that Orev is now part of the loan, he is the guarantor of the loan, even without a kinyan, is because it's due to that person's verbal commitment that the creditor put his hand in his pocket and said, fine, I'll lend you the money. And the Nimuka Yosef expands this idea earlier in the Gemara where he says, even though there's no formal kinyan, it's just with his words saying, I'll be the guarantor, that already schleps him into the situation he has to carry the can. Because the creditor could say to the debtor, or even to the Orev, if you were not part of the story, I would never have lent that guy money. Rabbi Gershom says a similar thing. If not for you, the guarantor, says the creditor, I would never have let my money into his hands. And therefore, Masha Rav Ashi, they're explaining, Nimuka Yosef, and we see also in Rabbi Gershom's opinion, that when Rav Ashi says that the benefit he has, that people trust him, and therefore he puts himself on the line for this loan, Nimuka Yosef says that's not the reason why he is mishtabed. That's the reason why it's not considered an asmachta, which is just a kind of a support to a loan and doesn't actually have halachic bearing. That's the explanation. But the real reason he becomes an orev is because he is the catalyst for the creditor extending the loan. So now we have two possibilities of why a guarantor becomes a guarantor without the formality of a kinyan. Two possible ways that could happen, or reasons why that could happen. The one possibility is, it's not because he, as the Orev, is getting benefit out of the credentials he now has in the community. You see, people trust me and they make loans based on me, but rather, he is the cause why the creditor extended the loan. Which means, thanks to the guarantor, the malveh was willing to part with his money. So that means We're not suggesting over here that there's some kind of a mechanism. The mechanism being, I am the Orev. Therefore, the money becomes available. It's more subtle than that. It's rather the fact that he's extending the money because he is relying on me. That's why I am now beholden to this loan. The fact that he gave the loan because he relied on the words of the Orev, I'll underwrite the loan, which shows obviously that the creditor trusts him. That's what causes the Orev to put himself in this position. In other words, the creditor is building the loan on the Orev, therefore the Orev is accountable for the loan. One possibility. The other possibility is Bayes. Totally different concepts, because he is getting a benefit now that people see him as a trustworthy individual, and it's worth it for him, therefore, to underwrite the loan. Because he's gaining something. That benefit that he gets is some form of a kinyan. It's not the typical formal kinyan, but a kinyan is usually I'm getting something, therefore you're getting something in return. Because he's getting the benefit of being seen as a trustworthy member of the community, that's what prompts him to put himself on the line and say, I'll repay the loan if the debtor cannot. Now, there are practical differences depending on which attitude you take. So let's go to the guy who's being beaten in the street. Now, he has a very clear distinction of what basis the guy is an Orev will have a practical distinction whether he needs a kinyan in that case or not. If we go with the first view, which is the reason that the Orev is now responsible to pay if the other guy defaults on the loan, is because he was the reason the creditor extended credit, that's not relevant here. So here when he comes upon this guy who's beating him up and says, let him go, I'll pay. You can't say he is the one making the malva extend the credit. The credit already happened long ago. And it had nothing to do with the guarantor, the fact that he lent him money in the first place. And that's why he's beating him up, because he didn't get his money back. So therefore, the creditor's not necessarily going to take this guarantor so seriously just because he said, I'll pay you. Therefore, his words do not automatically implicate him in the loan, and there has to be a formalization of a kinyan, like the Talmud Bavli said. That the halach is Rabbi Shmuel if there's a kinyan, because we don't take him at his word, because the malva is not building his loan on this guy. Whereas if you say the reason for the guarantor stepping into this role is because he's benefiting from his trustworthiness in the community, well, he's going to get the same value if he's, look at this, people are going to see me as the individual who stopped somebody from being beaten in the street over a loan that he had. I get benefit out of that. And therefore, I'm in, even just verbally. The fact that he stopped somebody from being beaten in the street is a great benefit and value to him. And on that basis, he put himself down as the guarantor on this loan. And that would be the basis why it is in the Talmud Bavli. The conclusion is that if you're saving the guy from a beating, you still have to make a kinyan in order to become his guarantor, whereas the Yerushalmi says you don't. Clearly the Bavli is going with the explanations given by the Nemuka Yosef and Rabbeinu Gershom. The very fact that I'm getting a benefit, because now people are going to trust me, it would not be reason enough that a person actually puts themselves on the line. It's just a technical detail to ensure that when I make that statement, it's not just like a throwaway statement, like something supporting the view that I'm trying to put forward. But rather, because the Gemara Bavli, fitting with the opinion of the Nemuka Yosef, or as expressed by the Nemuka Yosef, does not believe that having that value of the society seeing me as a trustworthy person is enough that I actually take on a financial burden. So normally, under what circumstances does a guarantor have to carry the financial burden? Because he is the catalyst when he's there up front at the beginning of the loan, and the only reason that the creditor is willing to give the loan is because of this man. That's reason enough why you should take that responsibility. Therefore, in the case where the individual is being assaulted on the street, at that point he's not the reason why the creditor is giving the money. There is no cause for this Arev to be an Arev, and therefore the only way you can make him into an Arev is you have to have a mechanism called a kinyan. Whereas the Yerushalmi's opinion is, according to the Yerushalmi, the reason why in a regular case where the person says, okay, I'll lend you the money if so-and-so stands guarantee, it's not because that's the reason is going to give the money. That's why the Arev is liable. But rather it's because the Arev sees a benefit in this, that now he is trusted by the community. And therefore, something similar will happen to the individual who is stepping in to stop somebody from being beaten. You see, the community is going to see me as a great guy. That's valuable to me. It's valuable enough that I'm actually going to pay the money. I don't need a kinyan to ratify that. So now we can go back to what Rabbi Yossi said and explain it not as this big shock. What do you mean? You're now making the guy who's just an Arev become the debtor. Rather, Rabbi Yossi is explaining what the Yerushalmi is saying. If there's a guy chasing somebody in the street, and somebody else comes along and says, let him be, and I'll pay you, you can collect from the one instead of the other. In other words, right? That Rabbi Yossi is not here giving us the conclusion that the practicality is leave the debtor, because that's what we originally thought, and only go after the Arev. That's not what he's saying. To suggest that the creditor only claims now from the guarantor and not from the debtor. And at that time, rather, Rabbi Yossi is using that to explain why the guarantor is even part of the financial consideration now. The fact that he said, leave him alone and I'll pay the money. What he's doing is, he is de-escalating the situation so that the creditor is not going to now go chasing after the borrower alone. At least in this moment, in this heated moment, he's redirecting the creditor's attention to himself to say, okay, give me the money. That gives him a tremendous amount of value and benefit. The fact that he has now entered the fray, that he is now the great hero, that he is now the person who's redirected the creditor's attention, that is of huge value to him, on which basis he actually puts himself into financial liability. So now we've got these two views of the Bavli and Yerushalmi, where the Bavli is saying that the basis of an Arev is, thanks to you, the loan went through. And therefore, if it's after the loan already went through, you need to make a kinyan to become the Arev. Versus the Yerushalmi says, I, as the Arev, stand to gain from being an Arev. And that's good enough for me to put myself on the line. The reason for that difference is because of a fundamental core difference between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. Which is a reflection of the difference between the population of Jews who lived in Bavel at that time versus the population who lived in Eretz Yisrael. It goes without saying that to work out what the switch is in the Arev's mind to make him financially liable must obviously speak to what was the norm in that society at that time. Like we see halachically, that if there is such a minhag where it is possible for a merchant to make himself liable for something without making a kinyan, if that's the minhag amokim. So therefore, the two different psychological factors that may contribute to why an Arev is liable for a loan depends on where you live and what the people feel in the place where you live. And that's very different in Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. The whole concept of an Arev, which means I could take responsibility for somebody else's loan, is part of a bigger concept in Judaism, which is Kol Yisrael Arevim, that every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. When did that happen? That went into effect. The Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us when the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael, at that point we accepted responsibility for our fellow Jews. Because coming into Eretz Yisrael turned us into a single unit, and therefore we carry that responsibility. So, that's the reason why the Gemara tells us that the Eibusher did not punish Yidden for personal private Averis until the Yidden were in Eretz Yisrael, where the community became one community, and so your private affairs actually are the business of the rest of the community. As the Rogatchover explains, at that point the whole Jewish people became like a single organism, not a whole lot of unrelated individuals. Therefore, it is possible for us to have responsibility for each other, and therefore it is possible for me to step in as the guarantor of your loan. But if we're not that single entity, we don't naturally have that immediate responsibility for each other. Which shows the distinction between living in Eretz Yisrael versus living in Bavel. The Gemara Brachas tells us that there isn't that sense of a big Jewish population in Bavel like there is in Eretz Yisrael. What the Gemara is actually saying is, as the Rogatchover points out, there isn't that networking, that linking. Which is the same reason why in Bavel you don't enact a communal fast. That's something that only happens in Eretz Yisrael. That will also explain why there's certain events in Jewish history that don't have fasts associated with them. Why? Because why no tiny tzibur? Because there's no real sense of a tzibur outside of Eretz Yisrael. Whereas Eretz Yisrael is the exact opposite. Eretz Yisrael is the environment that creates that sense of tzibur, of community between the Jewish people. Going back to the language that the Rogatchover used, when they crossed the Yarden, that turned us all into a single organism, and therefore it is possible for us to take responsibility for each other. So clearly, there's a greater sense of community, and hence a greater sense of responsibility in Eretz Yisrael than what you feel in Chutz La'aretz. Now, the reality is, once the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael and they accepted responsibility for our fellow Jews, obviously that is a permanent state, and it applies to Jews wherever we may be. That's why I can make a bracha for your mitzvah that you have to do. I'll get up and say, I'll mikra Megillah for everybody in the shul is listening to the Megillah, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. But the fact that we cannot enact a communal fast day outside of Eretz Yisrael in Bavel means that there's a lack of that sense of community. That implies that the ultimate state of unity, and therefore the ultimate state of accountability for each other, is in Eretz Yisrael much more than anywhere else. But Talmud Shel Bavel, therefore, if I'm learning Talmud Bavli, where that sense of unison and a single organism and therefore responsibility of Judaism is not as powerful. Then in that environment, if we're not feeling so connected, clearly we need to do something to create that connection and responsibility. So then, if it's at the time the loan's happening, the action is my words of I'll be the guarantor are causing your action of extending the loan. And if I appear on the scene after the loan already happened, where I'm not causing you to actually lose money, in other words, give away money, then I have to do another action, which is a kinyan, even in the case of Chonuk, as the Gemara concludes in Talmud Bavli, but there has to be a kinyan. Whereas the perspective of the authors of the Talmud Yerushalmi, Talmud Shel Eretz Yisrael, which is the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, Shebo Yisrael Meged Tzibur, where the Jewish people consistently have the sense of a single community. Therefore, there's a greater sense of accountability for each other and a greater unity. Not so. They say, you know what? We don't have to do an action in order to create that accountability and responsibility for each other. It's endemic. As long as the person feels that there's some benefit to him, that would be enough to convince him to put himself on the financial line and stand behind this loan. Now that also has a lesson for us. This has a lesson for us. When Yidden are living where we belong in Israel, where we live as a single organism, a single united community, and in a way that is clear, felt. Then when you're living in that reality, anything that is relevant to a single Jew, even if it's just a little bit of discomfort or pain, We feel so connected that if you're in pain, it's enough to make me put myself in a position of responsibility to alleviate your pain. In fact, that's actually my pleasure. In that environment of achdus, in that environment of community, I feel great because I helped another Yid feel less pain. And the reason is because I don't feel separate from the fellow Jew. We are one. Like the Gemara Yerushalmi elsewhere expresses it, it's like two hands of the same body. But outside of Eretz Yisrael in Bavel, where there is obviously absolute unity and connection and responsibility of all Yidden, but it's not so felt, it's not enough just to have that feeling and therefore I'm going to put myself on the line for my fellow Jew. I have to feel that the guy is not just in pain, he's actually losing something, then I'll step up. But if it's not so obvious that it's such high stakes, then I have to do something to illustrate clearly that I'm actually standing up for a fellow Jew. And that would be enough to convince the creditor that I am standing behind the debtor. So it's very clear that in Eretz Yisrael, the nature of the network, the connection, the unity, and therefore the responsibility is closer to the surface and easier to achieve than it is outside of Eretz Yisrael. And that has a spiritual lesson for us as well in the context of where we are in the Gemara, the end of Bava Basra, which is incredibly relevant to where we are in world history as well. We know that even though they're divided into three different masechtas, they actually are considered to be three gates of a single masechta, as is expressed in various places. And they belong to what theme? Nezikin, which is damages. The concept of damages is a spiritual concept of golus. Because what is golus? It's that there are negative, destructive forces that interfere with our ability to serve the Eibush and do what the Eibush wants. So what is Gemara, the tractate of Nezikin? That's how Nezikin is translated or expressed in Torah. So that actually expresses the type of Torah learning we do to neutralize those forces that interfere with our relationship with Hashem, which will then in turn neutralize the Golus and bring the Geula. That's the deeper reason why Maseches Nezikin is divided into three sections. The three chapters or three segments of Nezikin, Bava Basra, they represent the three stages of return from Golus. And that's why they're all actually one theme. As we've explained before, the three Bate Hamikdash are not three separate entities. It's a Beis Hamikdash we had, that we lost, that the Eibush is bringing back to us, albeit maybe in a different physical form. As we know, Rashi says in the opening pasuk of Parashas Pekudei that it says Mishkan, Mishkan twice. Remez the Mishkan shenismashkein b'shnei churbanin. It's alluding to the Beis Hamikdash that was taken as collateral twice when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. In other words, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash is not the end of the Beis Hamikdash. Rather, it's the Beis Hamikdash being held as security against our behavior. It's 100% intact, just temporarily being held by their creditor, which is the Eibush waiting for us to so-called pay back our debt of avodah. Following that logic, the third of the Bavos must refer to the third of the Geulas, which is our Golus, from which we're looking to have a Geula. And with that we can see a stark difference between how Bava Basra begins and how it concludes. The first Mishnah of Bava Basra is you have partners who want to divide a shared courtyard. What does that mean, Beruchnius? HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'Yisrael Shutfin Kvayochel. In spiritual terms, we're in the Eibishter partners in this endeavor to make a dirva tachtonim. V'ine agolosu shekam mechitza ben hashutfin. A golus means that there's a barrier between the two partners. There is something that interferes between us and Hashem. That's the beginning of Bava Basra. That's the beginning of this final golus. There's a separation between us and the Eibishter. But by the time you get to the end of the Masechta, now you're talking about the end of golus. Now we're talking about responsibility that we take for each other. That implies not only the responsibility that we take for fellow Jews because we're all united, but rather the unity between us and Hashem that comes out into the open. And Eibishter, in a sense, takes responsibility for us. Because Yidden have done things that we shouldn't have done, we are now indebted, in a sense, chas v'sholem, to the other side. But because we are the Eibishter's special nation, who are in a sense like his relatives, now so the Eibishter steps in as a guarantor to settle those debts. So our indebtedness to the Klippus, the Eibishter takes as his own. Which means practically, that the Eibishter empowers us to become free of those negative forces. And that gives us a far deeper spiritual perspective on what lies within the debate between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, whether there needs to be a kinyan or not in that emergency situation of the person who's being assaulted because of their debt. We know very well that at the end of the Golus, right when you're at the footsteps of Mashiach, the darkness is much thicker and darker and more impenetrable than ever. Like the Gemara tells us, for example, at the end of Saita, about this incredible darkness, both spiritually and materially, that we will experience just before Mashiach comes, or as you could say, we are experiencing in many respects right now. That's why the end of Baba Basra is talking about the person who's being assaulted in the street. Because that is what the Jewish people feel like at the end of the Golus. Because the darkness of the Golus is so intense that we feel suffocated by that darkness. And so therefore the Gemara says, in that emergency situation, both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi agree that Rabbi Shmuel is correct, the halacha is like him, that even when the person is in such a suffocating situation, that the Arev can step in and take that responsibility, and the creditor can now go after the Arev, which means spiritually. You could say that according to the strict letter of the law, we got ourselves into this trouble, we have to sort it out, we have to carry the responsibility. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shmuel, despite the fact that logic might have dictated that, the fact is halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel, Kohen Gadol, Isha Chesed, who is a Kohen Gadol representing absolute kindness. That the Eibishter steps into our shoes, so to speak, carries our load, and settles our debt. The only distinction, which is what the Bavli and Yerushalmi debate, is how does that work? When you're in Bavel, the world of Talmud Bavli, where there is incredibly powerful darkness, and therefore this unity between us and the Eibishter is not immediately obvious, something has to happen in order to create that Arevus. We have to approach the Eibishter and beg the Eibishter to get into our reality, so to speak, and so to speak, to take on our debt, our load. Whereas when you're looking through the lens of Talmud Yerushalmi, which is a brighter reality, it's much clearer that we and the Eibishter are one. So we don't have to beg the Eibishter, we just have to kind of draw the Eibishter's attention to the fact that we're suffering. All the pain that we're going through in this captivity of Golus, which expresses itself in our demanding of the Eibishter ad Mosai, how much longer? Al titnu domilai dechenu vad yosem Yisrael shleim tila ba'aretz. As we say in Slichas, don't put your blood / money on us until Eretz Yisrael is resettled. In other words, don't let us have to carry this can much longer. And that's enough, more than enough, that David should step in and bring the gula through Mashiach. All we have to do is reach out. Mashiach will then build the third, final Beis HaMikdash. And that Beis HaMikdash will be far more spectacular than the earlier Bate Mikdash, and that should happen immediately.